So good evening. This is the graveyard slot, isn't it, where the dedicated few kind of hang around. It's really kind of you. I've written some cards down to keep it to 16 minutes.
Good.
That's how disciplined we're going to be. So as Suki says, let's go to here. So Suki says, I'm going to talk about what big businesses can learn from startups, and I think it's a really fascinating subject. People who say that big business can't be entrepreneurial, I kind of defy them. That's not the case. But there's definitely some things that they may need to do differently, and I kind of feel like I live my life having that conversation at the moment, so I just thought share a few ideas today. Let's try and interrupt me as I go. I thought the loveliest part of this evening was when everyone was kind of asking questions and not letting Niels kind of stand up here, kind of like talk about parties, do you know what I mean, and everything being deadly quiet. So kind of don't do that to me. That interrupt me as I go, and then I can look down at my cards. Right. So why do I think that this subject's interesting? I think it's because huge markets have been sort of torn apart in the last, I don't know, since the internet arrived, and they get torn apart so rapidly and so quickly these days. You know, we launched BlackBerry in Europe a few years ago, and Jesus, look what's happened to them. And they're often disrupted by very small, scrappy startups, which I find very interesting. I find the demise of big business as a result of scrappy startups is kind of an interesting phenomenon. And there's a number of them that I've loved to watch. So this guy's called Nicholas Enstrom. So he was one of the founders of Skype. He was one of our early clients, and look what he did to international telephony. You know, we all use the service today. These guys founded Betfair, and they kind of knocked the high street bookies for six, and have really challenged them on the way they think about their business. So let's make this interesting. Who is he? No, he's not. No, he's not. Very, very good. Daniel Ek. So this guy is ripping apart the music industry at the moment, and everyone said he wouldn't pull it off, but he appears to be doing it very, very successfully. Okay, who's this guy now? This guy's done two very, very successful businesses. He's called Ev Williams. So he's done kind of the disruption of news. So we were all talking about Twitter earlier. So he's one of the Twitter founders, and he did Blogger before that, which was a really amazing service. And this guy is teaching me an awful lot at the moment. He keeps me awake at night, even more so than my kids. So he's the founder of Wonga. He's one of our clients, and he's a guy called Errol Damelin, and he breaks every single rule in the book, and you know, is very challenged in the media as a result of that. So let's just think about this for a moment. You know, some of you guys run agencies, and some of you are working in large organisations. And what would happen if a really brilliant, well-funded, great team startup decided to kind of turn their sights onto your market? And kind of let's consider what Mary Meeker says about this. So Mary Meeker, the great internet analyst, she's got 4 markets that she sees are being ripped apart at the moment, and it was interesting to watch Jessop's fall the other week. I mean, obviously not interesting, kind of sad to watch a brand like that fall, and obviously lots of people lose their jobs. But she said, you know, as a result of smartphones and things like Instagram, you know, just the whole marketplace has changed. And, you know, remember that brand called TomTom? Some of you probably still use it in your cars. Well, you know, as a result of smartphones and, you know, mapping services like Waze, who is a phenomenal Israeli startup, you know, totally destroyed their marketplace too. So now, who's done this? This is the destruction of we were talking about retailers earlier. There's a guy who's massively changing kind of the shape of retail. Guy called Jack Dorsey, another co-founder of Twitter. So he's not left Twitter, he's still very much there, and he's created this business called Square, which is massively disrupting kind of cash registers. And then, you know, if you haven't seen this, you should take a look at it. This is the sort of stuff that keeps British Gas awake at night. So these guys called Nest, who are disrupting kind of thermostats and kind of how people kind of like run energy in the home. Beautiful UI, you know, who'd even like tinkering with their thermostat? Well, now you're going to. So I'm willing to bet that whatever sector your companies are in, even FMCG, who also get disrupted too, I could find a startup somewhere in the Valley, somewhere in Silicon Alley, somewhere in Silicon Roundabout, somewhere in Silicon Wadi, you know, these places all around the world. I'd prepare to say that there is a threat, someone who's going to pull apart your marketplace. And we talk these days to a lot of large businesses who are concerned about this and obviously want to protect the status quo. Now, the classic sort of big business response is a kind of a legal one. Someone's going to hit your market, they're going to attack your IP, they talk to their lawyers immediately. And that's not always the best strategy in dealing with kind of like startups. Because these days, as a result of social media and everything Niels was saying earlier, it's very easy to defend yourself as a startup and kind of claim that you're being abused and attacked. And actually, it was interesting. I was lucky enough to be working in Skype in the early days, and those guys were being litigated against left, right, and centre. And nothing ever came to pass. They paid a fair amount of money to lawyers to address it, but you know. And now Telefonica is one of our largest clients, but it's like the telephony businesses were just desperately trying to pull them out through litigation, and it didn't work. So another approach to kind of dealing with this is to buy them. Do you remember when Rupert Murdoch bought MySpace, that other great social media business? And it was amazing, wasn't it? You know, they paid almost $600 million for it, and he sold it for $35 million later. I mean, that's a pretty serious write-down by anyone's standards. More importantly, he kind of destroyed a nice business, didn't he? I mean, it wasn't doing as well as Facebook, and it certainly wasn't doing badly though. So it kind of raises the question of how well startups can be integrated into big business, and a whole new conversation on that. So Albion, we think there's a third way for kind of corporates to kind of to address this sort of threat of startups, and it's to do the corporate startup. And that's what I wanted to chat about today, because it's kind of an interesting phenomena. It's a new approach to R&D inside big business, but it requires potentially a different way of thinking about business, different processes. And obviously, we were talking about Sainsbury's earlier today, which has an incredibly strong culture, clearly, very, very clear kind of, way of being. And interestingly, in really strong cultures like Sainsbury's or any business like that, maybe that culture isn't great to kind of foster startups because it's so good for being a big business, not necessarily ideal for fostering little businesses. I'm getting a lot of nodding along here. Go on, talk to it for a moment and I'll try and catch up on my cards.
Very true. I think we've been doing quite a lot of training with senior management teams over the last year. We've been doing quite a lot of training to try and get that innovation into the business, and I even met somebody in new business development this morning who was saying, it's really hard to get change projects through in this organisation because it is a big bureaucratic organisation. You still have that, and the board recently went to America and have come back talking about pilotyping. So actually, you good buzzword, and about how we should be thinking much more about just getting things out there and having this kind of attitude.
So it's so basically, I find my week's now consumed with it, and we're doing a lot of work in this area. And it's kind of like, so let's just talk a little bit about it. So what is the corporate startup? Well, this is one that we did 3 years ago. So we were, when we stopped working with Skype, Telefonica hired us to create this business. It's an MVNO. It's called GiffGaff, and it was born of an insight inside their organisation that there was an audience that was socially very savvy, wanted a low-cost solution, and was rejecting kind of big corporate telecoms. It's now one of the fastest growing parts of their business. And Aviva came to us to do something interesting where they again saw a kind of a narrow segment that the Aviva brand didn't seem to serve very well, and also they didn't want to go on the comparison sites. So kind of like we created Quote Me Happy, which was a nice piece of IP actually that had been created for the Norwich Union brand previously. And we're working with a few others in the same sort of area at the moment. And so what I thought I'd do now is just kind of talk a little bit about, why the corporate startup is happening and how you could do it differently yourself. There's this guy who actually developed the original kind of thinking. Is called Clayton Christensen, and he actually developed the thought around disruption back in the 80s. And it was a lovely idea then, but it wasn't very easy to actually execute. But some things have changed. Somehow timing has kind of moved on, and I suppose the internet means now that large businesses can do corporate startups very, very quickly, and they can do it fast, which is very interesting. So one of the big things that large businesses often struggle with is getting stuff out the door. And our observation now is that it is actually possible to do startup fast, to do it commercially, so to make money on day one rather than waiting for 3 years to see some sort of return on an R&D investment. And also to create a proposition that gets talked about. I mean, giffgaff is a really good example of this, where if you don't know the business, the big point of difference in it is that customers provide customer service. There are no call centres, and customers are paid to provide that service to the business. So it kind of created a really interesting business model for them. And fundamentally, these businesses are harnessing the skills of entrepreneurs inside big business. There are many entrepreneurs sitting inside large businesses who are looking potentially to do their own thing or to work in more entrepreneurial businesses, and they may leave a big business as a result of not having kind of an opportunity to do this. So you're sitting there thinking to yourself, oh my God, Jason, this is really interesting. How do I do it? How many of you are sitting there thinking to yourself, how do I do it? Is anyone in the room thinking to themselves, good, excellent, very good, because that's the next bit I'm going to talk about. Well, for a start, I think big businesses have an enormous kind of data set that they can harness to understand what the opportunity is. And they can predict their market often more easily than a startup can do. Because we work with lots of startups, and the one thing they don't necessarily have is access to data, relevant information, and they often come up with insights based on hunches, but rather than based on kind of empirical data. But one thing you've got to do is build your team. And this is a really interesting challenge for kind of corporations. Sometimes the talent isn't immediately available inside the organisation. And this is kind of an interesting kind of like piece of advice for you. If you're looking to put together a kind of a dream team from inside the organisation, and I think they do have to come from within than from without, you need a hipster. So what's a hipster? A hipster is a designer, right? So you need some sort of design skill inside the business, and you need a hacker. Well, the hacker, you've got to have some technologist, someone who gets how to do developments, someone who knows how to deliver the solution. And you need a hustler, probably someone like me, someone who can build something fast and who's willing to think very commercially about the opportunity. And that fundamentally is the combination of talent. Now, if you're Steve Jobs, you are both a hipster, a hacker, and a hustler all in one. So's Mark Zuckerberg. Rarely do these people exist in life, and you often need to kind of combine these skills. But be wary of this, because sometimes there's phonies inside businesses. So make sure you're dealing with people who aren't wanting to kind of create they're not interested in ideas, they're interested in reality, and they're looking at making money fundamentally. So if you can build your team, then the one piece of advice that we give a number of businesses that we work with is, for God's sake, get out of HQ's offices. Because however nice it is, however interesting it is, there's things that go on at HQ which kind of tends to kind of destroy a sense of startup, a sense of identity, a new way of doing things. And it kind of is at odds with the concept of a startup. So the best thing you can do is find bloody cheap space. Now, this does not have to be a warehouse loft in Shoreditch, which I may add is extremely expensive these days. Pick a warehouse space somewhere in Reading or wherever and make sure it's cheap, and but get out of the mothership and get out of the core environment. And always in the instances where this takes place, it's a demonstration of intent, a desire to be separate. And then you need to find your early adopters, your fans. Often big business makes the mistake of thinking that they have to do a startup which is going to appeal to a really large audience, and they don't have to. Startups naturally appeal to very narrow audiences in the first instance, and then can grow from there. So find your fans, find your early adopters. It sounds kind of obvious, but it's something you've got to do. And then for me, and I suppose I can tell you this from my own company as well, or from businesses I've been involved with, it's always about momentum. So the R&D tends to be a process which is kind of quite empirical, slow-moving. I was talking to someone from Philips in the crowd here tonight, and they agreed that the kind of engineering kind of approach of Philips maybe has slowed it down rather than kind of helped it to sort of speed itself up. So startup is always about momentum, and do anything to create momentum. What I do is set very aggressive timing plans and force people to hit them at any cost. And by doing so, even if you're delivering a slightly substandard product, you're creating momentum in the business. And I think this is probably one of the things that corporates find the hardest thing to do, because they love to turn out polished whatever. And startup just isn't polished, ever. And kind of iterate. I suppose this is the kind of, the most important thing in startup is constant iteration. So get it out the door and then constantly refine as you go. And this principle just holds good in all businesses, where, it's very, very important to constantly be looking for feedback from your beta testers, from your early adopters, and kind of really listening to them. And for me, it's about not listening to shareholders. All entrepreneurs say that their VC really is not a very helpful person on the board. And I think so shareholders in any business are often, the one barrier to success. I know actually in my own business, where I'm a major shareholder, sometimes I'm making decisions as a business owner, which is not necessarily in the interest of the business, but it's kind of in my personal interest. And I think it's true in startup as well. And then it's about metrics. I mean, this is really interesting. From an ad guy, it's not about brand in the early days. It's all about kind of acquisition and performance. And if you can't create that momentum around acquiring customers, your brand is somewhat irrelevant. So over-polished brand early, for me, isn't important. Culture is very important. So if we want to call brand culture, then I think that's a slightly different conversation. So now you really are thinking to yourself, this is sounding great, Jason. I'm feeling excited. I think I'm going to do a startup. But how am I going to sell it to my board? And what we always tell people on this is do it with stealth. The best thing you can do is to create something, not tell the board until it's done, and you can show them something. I don't believe in the importance of asking permission. I think you've got to get to a prototype, basically. If you show people a document, they'll never sign it off. So get to a prototype really early. So being in stealth is very, very important. And do it for low cost. Because when you do finally tell the board that you've done something, for God's sake, make sure that it's been done cheap. Because they hate massive investment. So it's do it in stealth, do it low cost. And I'm just going to sort of finish here on just one final thought of stay really humble. This is this really lovely kind of blog post by a guy called Linus Torvalds, who kind of developed the Linux system, which I think at the last valuation was something like $20 billion or something like that. And this was the original blog post he did, asking for sort of feedback personally from kind of his community. And I think, it's just very interesting that the most successful entrepreneurs or the most successful startups have started by just humbly asking for people's input. And I think now we should open for questions or whatever it is. And I think that was under 16 minutes.